Before every wise guy from New York City to Florida had a Rolex.
I'm a fat crook from New Jersey.
Before Alec Baldwin uttered the famous words, "You see this watch?" And before Pablo Escobar became the king of cocaine and the wealthiest criminal in history wearing a blinged out date, there was Jack Carter.
I'm the villain in the family, remember?
Okay, hi guys, and welcome to the show. Today we return to one of my favorite subjects where cinema, style, culture, and horology intersect and legends are born. In previous videos, we discussed the coolness of the Breitling Navitimer and its lesser-known facts associated with its iconic status. I also discussed the evolution of the Omega Speedmaster, and before that, we looked at the Omega Speedmaster and how it was utilized perfectly into the silver screen in an underrated neo-western thriller, The American, from 2010. Today, it's the turn of Rolex in a film that took the date and the brand to a whole new level of coolness. It went on to become extremely influential, a cult classic, and if you have not seen it, do check it out. I highly recommend it. And more about my wristwatch check a little bit later on. During the 1960s, crime movies were trending. At the crest of this new wave, forgive the pun, was the French maestro Jean-Pierre Melville, who became well known for his minimalist and stylish neo-noir films, most notably Le Samouraï from 1967, arguably his penultimate gangster movie. It was influenced by American films of the 1930s and 40s, but it also coincided with a relaxation in film censorship. This in turn allowed a new generation that followed Melville to produce more uncompromising films, with many directors pushing the boundaries of acceptability. Get Carter was released in 1971 and was a film that explored this new freedom. In fact, the project went from concept to finished film in just 10 months and was based on the novel Jack Returns Home by Ted Lewis. So Get Carter is a classic British crime revenge movie directed by Mike Hodges and set in the squalid, seedy underworld of England during the austerity of the 1970s. Jack Carter, the main protagonist, is played impeccably by British film icon Michael Caine, who at the time was a rising star and almost at the peak of his acting career. He plays the ruthless London gangster who returns to his birthplace of Newcastle to attend the funeral of his brother Frank, who died in a drink-driving accident. Unsatisfied with the official explanation, Jack investigates for himself. Inevitably, vengeful violence ensues, with some debauchery along the way as he regains a feel for the city and its hardened criminal element. The uncaring, unflinching, and uncompromising Carter is already living on borrowed time, as he is also having a torrid affair with his mob boss's girlfriend Anna, played by the prominent sex symbol of the time, Britt Ekland. What watch did he wear? Well, the Rolex Day-Date, of course. Today, the Day-Date is synonymous with go-getters, captains of industry, and the darker side of entrepreneurship, cartel kingpins, mafiosi, and generally gangsters too. What is crucial here is not just only how it subverts the association of this watch, the president's watch and so on and so forth, but also, most importantly, just as importantly, how the watch was worn. Some have speculated it was actually a solid yellow gold DateJust 1601. However, in various promotional material, you can see the day display towards the 12 o'clock, making it most likely the day-date 1803 of that period. But more importantly, also judging by Michael Caine's own penchant for day-dates in real life, I bet on the latter. Regardless, it set a stylistic precedence that, combined with how differently this film portrayed criminals, especially Michael Caine's lead role. Rolex would forever now become not just aspirational for the good guys, like James Bond for example, but for anti-heroes and villains as well. One could also say this had a trickle-down effect on the DateJusts too, considering its similar looks, of course. Its own rise to infamy in the subsequent 90s-80s yuppie culture, occasional Seiko 5 stand-ins aside in some scenes, very much was encapsulated by American Psycho decades later. Now I'm going to interrupt here, I do apologise. Just want to make sure you've clicked like, okay? Right, back to the video. Michael Caine was very much a rising star at this time, and he made a name for himself playing these lovable, charismatic, charming characters, where here it was a dramatic departure from his his typical role. But what was interesting is that he still is as infinitely quotable. Some of the lines of Jack Carter, I mean, just absolutely classic.
You're a big man, but you're in bad shape. With me, it's a full-time job. Now behave yourself. Right?
During an interview for a California newspaper, Caine said that one of the reasons he wanted to make the picture was his background. And I quote, "In English movies, gangsters were either stupid or funny. I wanted to show that they're neither." As a co-producer, he pushed for the film to be more realistic, a more grounded screen depiction of the British underworld. He wanted more violence, more outwardly nasty and shocking behaviour, and even using his personal knowledge of criminal acquaintances to inspire that stoic look and scornful performance. This all worked magically with his famous London Bermondsey accent. The juxtaposition of the supremely elegant three-piece navy blue Savile Row suit by the famed Doug Howard contrasted against the backdrop of the industrial grimness of northern England during that era. A sartorial look typically associated with the upper classes and forever mimicked by gangsters as they try to appear more legitimate and command respect with pinky rings and fine, luxurious clothes. Jack Carter concentrates on the latter. His main bit of bling is the watch, played down by not being on a solid, fully gold bracelet, but rather on a black leather strap. The result is surprisingly super dressy and thus inherently a more sophisticated look, elevated nicely by some gold oversized cufflinks, finishing off the outfit exquisitely. The combination of the watch, the suit, the trench coat, the shotgun, the memorable lines, the smouldering coolness, all come together to create an indelible, long-lasting icon. Interestingly, there are some strong parallels to another movie that is famous for featuring the Rolex brand, and that I have talked about before. Michelangelo Antonioni's massively important and influential film Blow Up from 1966. In many ways, Get Carter is an inversion of Blow Up's swinging 60s London set thriller. In Blow Up, it centers around the glamorous world of fashion photography, whereas in Get Carter, it features the then still taboo world of pornography. In both movies, these forms of photography are used to uncover essential clues in the plot. It's almost as if Get Carter was deliberately saying, the 60s, long dead. It's all this new vile world of the 1970s, and not a lovable character in sight. To further emphasize this darker world, the super bleak cinematography of Wolfgang Suchitsky has grim scenes reminiscent of L.S. Lowry paintings during the day to show the industrial wasteland. During the night, it is moody, ominous, and brooding like a chiaroscuro by Caravaggio. It's no surprise the Italian Baroque genius, who pretty much invented chiaroscuro style, was also a murderer who loved to brawl. This style works together wonderfully to contrast the overly glamorous and typically glitzy portrayals of gangsterism that was so cliched in movies before this. Perhaps today we are overly desensitized, right? But we got to remember at the time it was a dramatic shift away from the overly predictable, happily ever after ending movies that Caine was predominantly doing until Get Carter. And on the 40th anniversary in 2011, the great Mark Kermode said this.
If Get Carter is 40 years old, how come it still looks so young?
Director Mike Hodges also brought a distinctive feel to the movie. His own background was in making documentary films, resulting in Get Carter seeming more realistic, gritty, and lurid. To tie the film together beautifully, and as if Caine could not get any cooler, Roy Budd's minimalist, laid-back jazz score reflects the suaveness of the character and complements the modern neo-noir feel of the subject matter perfectly. It's sexy in the right sleazy way that it needs to be, without being too cheesy, while also being foreboding and even soulful when it needs to be. So back to the watch. Now, why the day date? And it has largely to do with MGM closing their British branch or their British studios around this time. So therefore, all the films that they were producing had relatively small budgets. They were trying to cut back. Therefore, the watch was undoubtedly Michael Caine's own watch. In fact, he wore it in several subsequent movies throughout the 1970s, like the 1972 movie also directed by Mike Hodges called Pulp, from the following year, again on a black leather strap, for a third time in the Sleuth movie from 1972, this time on the full gold bracelet. The day-date would be his main watch for the next 2 decades. Perhaps the best example is the highly overlooked black comedy, A Shock to the System, where he plays a scheming, oleaginous, murderous yuppie living in New York City.
Graham Marshall was having a bad day.
Graham?
What?
What is the matter with you tonight?
A bad job.
There is a man in my office.
Now he just killed to have a good time.
Yay!
Despite the softer metal, the day-date has 2 very compelling qualities that make it a fitting choice for somebody with, pugilistic tendencies or just wants to party hard. The oyster case is guaranteed to be waterproof to 100 meters, and the movement inside has all the well-established traits with its architecture that has earned Rolex a reputation for robustness and dependability. Caine's solid 18-karat yellow gold 1803 housed the automatic caliber 1556, a non-quickset movement that ran from about 1965 to 1977. Then the single quickset day dates were introduced in 1977 with the 18038. After that, the caliber 3155 was introduced in 1988 with the 18238, which was something of a revelation because it was the first model to feature the double quickset. This is actually my personal favorite and the version I currently own. As we all know, the 1970s was not just a tumultuous time in England, but also for the entire Swiss watch industry, who are now starting to feel the effect of the quartz crisis following Seiko's introduction of the technology in 1969. Thankfully for Rolex, they had already started down this path of diversification into aspirational luxury way before, despite the 1950s and 60s being an era where they introduced so many tool watches that would change the watch world forever, like the GMT Master, Explorer, Submariner, and later Sea Dweller. Interestingly, 1969 was also the year we saw the first all-gold Submariner, for example. It gives you an idea of where Rolex was heading. This was unlike the previously discussed history and evolution of Omega's Seamaster and Constellation lines, with their futile attempts to compete with quartz or squander money on avant-garde and overproduced watches that did not sell well. Rolex mainly stuck to their mechanical guns, thus successfully getting through the storm to become the powerhouse it is today. There was, of course, the oyster quartz, an oyster quartz day date, which took 5 years to develop, ran from 1977 to 2001. The only time Rolex made quartz watches, a chapter I think they'd love to forget. Very refined, actually, and very accurate, even with a thermal compensator. But, they wanted to make automatics, so that's where they went. Having said that, Michael Caine did own one, many, many years later, and I think you can just about spot it in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, fantastic comedy with Steve Martin, because you can tell that those kind of angular edges, that very particular integrated bracelet. The movie was a pivotal turning point for both British cinema and iconic Rolex watches. The perception of the day-date now became more exciting and an edgy status symbol for every lovable rogue, villain and scoundrel off and on screen. No longer just reserved for the good guys or aspiring world leader. The film itself would go on to influence everyone from Quentin Tarantino, Shane Meadows, Guy Ritchie, Steven Soderbergh, Sylvester Stallone, and so on, featuring in endless top 100 lists from respected publications as one of the greatest British movies of all time. So there we have it. Let me know your thoughts, queries, comments, opinions, all the rest of it down below, and especially any nominations for films with cool watches you'd like to see covered in the future episodes. Don't forget to like this video, very, very important indeed. And as always, guys, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Okay, ciao.